everybody, and thanks for joining us today. This is David Robinson. I'm the Director of Membership and Meetings for the Linguistic Society of America, and this is the webinar on abstract writing, how to convince in a page. We're going to take just a few more minutes and wait for the rest of our attendees to get here, but we'll get started in just a couple of minutes, so sit tight and we'll be back in touch again soon. Okay, it's about 5 after, so I think we can go ahead and get started. Hello again, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on abstract writing, how to convince in a page. I'm David Robinson, the Director of Membership and Meetings for the Linguistic Society of America. Right now, you'll see on your screens a short presentation about the LSA and some of the things we do. And if you're not already a member, you'll see a special discount offer for attendees of this webinar. Thank you for taking the time out of your afternoon to join us. I'm happy to welcome Khalil Iskarous of the University of Southern California. Khalil is an Associate Professor of Linguistics at USC and Associate Editor of the LSA's flagship journal, Language. And most important for today's webinar, he's the co-chair of the LSA Program Committee, which determines all the scholarly content that gets presented at the LSA Annual Meeting. Today, he will be discussing successful abstract writing through reviewing a set of abstracts that were selected for presentation at the LSA's last annual meeting in Salt Lake City. He'll be showing us how successful abstracts gain the attention of the reviewer in the first few sentences, proceed by building the argument, and are then able to preview the abstract argument made in the work by using just a few sentences. There'll be lots of time for Q&A, so have your questions ready. Before we get started, I want to take just a moment to make sure you're familiar with the GoToWebinar dashboard if you haven't used it before. First, you'll see an audio widget on your dashboard that will allow you to hear the audio portion of this webinar using your computer's speakers or by phone. Your microphones are disabled for this webinar, but when it comes time for Q&A, you can ask your questions using the questions widget that you'll see on your dashboard. Second, we have a couple of handouts that you're free to download at any time during the webinar. They include the presentation that you'll be seeing today and the sample abstracts, and they are, not surprisingly, in the handouts widget on your dashboard. And finally, we just want to take a quick survey so Khalil can get a better idea of your experience in submitting abstracts to a scholarly conference. It'll take less than a minute for everyone to answer and for the results to be displayed. So I am going to go ahead and launch it now. So go ahead and answer, and when everybody has replied, we'll go ahead and review the results. Okay, and I see almost everyone has voted, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share the results. So I think you should be able to see them. 17% have never submitted an abstract to a scholarly conference before. 37% of you have submitted 1 to 5 times to a scholarly conference. About another third, 6 to 10 times, and 15% of you more than 10 times. So that concludes my part of the introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to Khalil.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for taking time from your summer vacation to go with me through this presentation. So I want to just sort of pause and make sure that everyone can see the slides. So I think I'll leave a minute so that if people can't see the slides, maybe they can contact David through the chat mechanism, so that before I start, we make sure everyone can see the slides on their page. David, do you think I should go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead. So I've given you, okay. You should be able to share your screen and also open your webcam now.
Oh, okay, that's right. So here is the webcam. Okay, so if you'd like to, you can also see me in the webcam. Okay, so yeah.
We can't see your screen yet, though.
I see.
Be able
to... okay, sorry.
There you go.
Okay, good. Thanks. Okay, so we'll start. So what I want to start with is to just discuss, just to give you an overview at the beginning. So I'll tell you why I'm interested in the methodology of our field, especially in abstract writing. I will tell you what I think is the basic structure of an abstract, and then how authors play with the basic structure, producing interesting variations. I will discuss a variety of strategies used for convincing someone of the argument that you're presenting. And I will be illustrating throughout with these points with successful abstracts from the 2018 LSA meeting, which covers the spectrum of subfields of linguistics. So when I started my own graduate studies, I hadn't had a single course in the field, and it made it quite difficult to argue and present ideas in linguistics, as well as, even just doing homework, which is a lot of argumentation. So one of my professors, Georgia Green, pointed me to 2 dissertations, those of Tanya Reinhardt's and David Perlmutter's, and told me that I could learn linguistic argumentation by reading these works and watching how arguments are built within this field. Since then, I have taken lots of interest in argumentation and presentation of ideas, especially because I think a lot of good ideas come and go without having the effects they could have had because they were poorly argued. And very often, these ideas are rediscovered a lot later, not because they were bad ideas, but because they didn't have the effect that they ought to have because of the structure of the argument that was presented. And I'm thoroughly convinced that good argumentation, especially in the abstract setting, is a learned skill, not some innate quality. Some people argue well and some people don't argue well, things like that, because I know I didn't have that skill, and I learned it by looking at actual arguments made by great linguists and saw the process and how it's actually developed. And why I'm focusing here on the abstract is that it's the first entry of the student into the larger community of linguists beyond one's own educational institution, and is therefore a ticket, so to speak, to the field. And I think that if you write a good abstract, you're on your way to writing a good paper. The ideas I present here, however, are my own hypotheses about what makes a good abstract. So there is no formula for making your abstract automatically accepted, obviously, since there are several reviewers with their own ideas about what makes a good abstract. So please use these ideas at your own risk. Okay, we'll start. So the basic structure is deceptively trivial. But I will ask you to sort of keep going with me, even if you think that it's trivial at the beginning. So here is what I think is the basic structure of a good abstract. You have to ask a question, and you have to answer the question. The coherence of an abstract depends on the complementarity between question and answer. How good an abstract is, I think, depends on how interesting and important the question is, and how well the answer fits the question sufficiently for the purpose of an abstract. What I mean by that is, obviously, in a paper, you have a much higher burden to prove your answer beyond that of an abstract. But within an abstract, you still need to give that answer. And I really want to emphasize throughout the talk this complementarity between question and answer, and that's the basis for how a good abstract is built. And in my years so I've been judging abstracts for about 20 years, and I've been on a variety of the conference committees, etc. So I've been either a reviewer or I've read most of the abstracts for different conferences. So I've read many, many hundreds of abstracts. And I think a lot of the bad abstracts that I've read have errors related to going away from the question-answer format of an abstract. So one of the most common types of errors is the absence of the question-answer structure. And what especially students early on in their careers will do is to have a different kind of format, which is I work on phenomenon X in language or dialect or register A. And the rest of the abstract is, here's what I have to say about this phenomenon in this language. And I find that a lot of the abstracts that don't make it to conferences and that don't kind of see further development are following this kind of format. Now, having said that, most of our work is about some phenomenon in some language or dialect or register. So I'm not trying to tell you that you shouldn't be working on phenomena in languages or dialects or registers. Obviously, our work centers on picking a phenomenon and talking about it in either in one language or in many languages. However, the structure of an abstract, or even more generally, a paper covering how you talk about a phenomenon in a language is different from here's what I have to say about this phenomena in this language or dialect or register. In a way, what I will try to show you is how do you take, I work on this phenomenon in this language, and to develop it into a question-answer format that has cohesion or coherence because of answers are answers to question, and there's a connectivity from the beginning of the abstract to the end of the abstract. Another very common type of problem in an abstract is one is following the question answer type format, but the question is chosen to be too small and insignificant of a question. And then the answer is basically unrelated to the question that was asked. Another kind of opposite problem is the question is way too big and way too general. And then necessarily the answer that is given is too little of an answer. And what I would like to help you with is how to rewrite an abstract that could have potentially been written in the first time that you wrote it as I'm working on phenomenon X in language A, and help you to see how you can take your ideas and rephrase them in this question answer type format. So when I say ask a question, I do not mean that you should literally ask a question with a question mark at the end, even though that is possible. And as you'll see, it is a nice way of directly asking the question that you're going to be concentrating on in the abstract. I mean something a lot sort of more general than that could be pursued in ways other than literally asking a question. Asking a question generates tension, which is diffused by answering the question. And there are various ways of achieving this tension, most of which is indirect. So does not consist of literally asking a question at the very beginning or early on in the abstract. So I will now discuss what I think is the fountain of the various indirect ways of asking a question within the context of linguistics. So there's a very old tradition within generative linguistics especially of hypothesis A, hypothesis B, presentation of a question, and the generation of tension that's resolved throughout the abstract. So this is how this type of thinking goes. This is how you ask the question. So you say, there are two hypotheses, A and B. A predicts the data in the world to be like such, whereas hypothesis B predicts that data in the world will be like such. And those X and Y are different from each other. And this is how tension is built. Because what you're indirectly doing is you're asking which is true of the world, A or B. Okay, I hope you're all getting this idea. So you're proposing within the world of ideas some hypothesis A and some hypothesis B. Then you're making predictions. You're drawing predictions from each of the hypotheses, and hopefully those predictions are different. And that's why these hypotheses are different from each other. Then the answer begins with, here is the data, here is the evidence. And perhaps the evidence is like X, which is what's predicted by A. And therefore, the conclusion of the abstract is hypothesis A is the correct one. And that's what I mean by tension has been diffused. So this is a model that has about a 40 to 50-year-old history within the field of linguistics. Perhaps it extends before that, but it became quite formal very early on in the history of the field, about 40 or 50 years ago. And it has this kind of, and you see how this lends itself to the structure of an argument. So you're presenting hypotheses about how things could be. You're presenting what the predictions of those hypotheses are. Then your data enters as evidence for either of the hypotheses, and the conclusion and the discussion are basically being able to state which of the hypotheses about the world is the correct one. So this kind of hypothesis A, hypothesis B tension sets up a question about the world, which is answered through the data. And you see how tension is built up and released using this method. And I hope you also see how coherent a discourse is generated by this method, because what comes later is very much related to what comes before in a very organic way, rather than, you know, I'm working on this topic and here's a bunch of stuff that I found out. So the good news is that there is this hypothesis A, hypothesis B business. The bad news is that I'm starting to realize, okay, I see. Yeah, so the bad news is it's extremely rare nowadays that arguments are this forward to state and that this very explicit format is being used. But just to give you an idea of how prominent this kind of thinking was, one of its developers was David Perlmutter, and who's at the University of California at San Diego. And when a festschrift was written for him, the title of the festschrift was literally Hypothesis A / Hypothesis B. So I'm not just characterizing some very abstract. This was a very concrete way developed by linguists from very early on. This was developed through his dissertation and other people's dissertations around the early 70s. That very, very concretely shows you how you ought to argue. So in our world today, I think we still have this notion of hypothesis A versus hypothesis B, and I think it still structures abstracts, but it's a lot more subtle. And now I want to discuss different subtle ways in which the same kind of structuring ideas are, I forgot something. So I want to just, when I started in linguistics, which was a couple of decades ago, basically most people knew about this way of pursuing arguments. And I want to do a very quick survey that David will do. So David, are you there?
Yep, I'll go ahead and launch these.
Can you flash on that survey? So we're just going to be doing a very quick survey because I'm really interested in this, whether you've heard about this argumentation strategy before.
All right, it looks like almost everybody has voted, so I'm going to close the poll and share the results. So there you are, Khalil.
Okay. All right. So this is, it's good that still about 40% of people have heard about this kind of thinking before. Very good. So let me, okay. And again, just to be clear why I'm identifying the notion of asking a question with the hypothesis A, hypothesis B thinking, it's because implicit in this A versus B hypotheses is the question about which is true. And I think that that's the essence of this discourse, this posing a question. And the development of hypothesis A, hypothesis B allows you to state the question in a very formulaic way. by basically asking the question, which of these hypotheses is true of the world? And to prepare this, this talk, I've examined 18 abstracts quite explicitly, but the ideas that I'm presenting are really based on things that I've been seeing literally for about 20 years. So this is not just a something based on these 18 abstracts, but with these 18 abstracts, I try to actually go in and identify parts of the argument that are really quite crucial. And I'll only, I think, be showing you examples from 12 of them, and those are in the handout. And I'll give you, so if you look at the handout, you'll see underlining of different parts of these abstracts in different colors, and I'll be going through in my presentation and telling you what I mean by these different colors, etc. So I do believe that these results generalize to many other abstracts. However, obviously, a fuller study may reveal other subtle ways of asking a question in an abstract. So I'm going to give an example of this hypothesis A, hypothesis B. So this is the beginning of one of the abstracts. And you can just, I'll give you a minute to just quickly read through it. But what I underlined as red in this case is hypothesis A. What I underlined as blue is, I think, what is basically hypothesis B within this abstract. So the author of this abstract, as well as the authors of all the abstracts that I picked, and actually all the abstracts I've looked at recently, and I last year as a member of the, as a co-chair of the program committee, I looked at about 80 to 100 abstracts. So we try for there is a whole programming committee which has many people, but then there are the co-chairs, and we try to have a kind of a quality check by the co-chairs reading as many of the abstracts as possible in order to ensure sort of, that someone or a couple of people have looked at all the abstracts, which is an important kind of quality check on the whole committee's work. And what I'm telling you about is, what I'm telling you now is that very, very rarely will an author say, there are two hypotheses. First hypothesis is such and such, hypothesis B is such and such. Much more commonly, and in all the examples that I will be discussing here, we have things like this where they could be in different paragraphs, but they clearly establish an opposition and a tension that the flow of the rest of the whole abstract is the diffusion of that tension. And I hope you see what I mean by that by just looking at these few sentences. So there is the configurational view, there is the non-configurational view. And setting up that opposition about that language, which type of language is it, is going to be something that the whole rest of the abstract, the presentation of the data, is going to be trying to show that, for instance, the first hypothesis that this language is actually configuration is the case. Here's another example from a different field within linguistics. So again, I'll give you a minute to look at the abstract and read the first few sentences. So what you see here is the first paragraph contains a lot of background, which is very often necessary. But within that background, as I read through this abstract several times, I started to notice that the true opposition, the true generation of tension within this abstract depends on the opposition between what has been done previously in the field, which is a hypothesis B here, that's why I underline it with B, versus what this work was going to do, which is to look at things like directives and to use speech act theory to look at cultural influence on gender ideology, etc. So this opposition between those two sentences, and it's not exclusively those two sentences, but it's this opposition that I think is really important in setting up this abstract. And you'll see, for instance, in the earlier abstract, the oppositions were closer to each other. Sometimes that's a good thing because you're able to, it's very clear for the reader what is being, what the alternative hypotheses are. And another thing to see in this case is that this is not always the case, but you really usually try to pick your hypotheses to be as mutually exclusive as possible. Because if they're mutually exclusive, they're predicting different things about the world. Okay, this is very clearly seen in the first abstract, where there are configurational languages and they have their own properties, and there are non-configurational languages and they have very, very different properties. It's not so easy, otherwise this would be, there would be no content to this abstract, but obviously there is content because those two things are not as mutually exclusive in their predictions about the data as, but at least you try and make your hypotheses be truly different from each other and predict different things. And I think those two abstracts that I just showed you have this kind of structure. Here's another abstract. And actually, in this abstract, what I'm showing you is towards the third paragraph. So in this particular abstract, which is more about corpus linguistics, a lot of setting up needed to be done. And this is not a bad thing. This is sometimes quite necessary. So, but towards the middle of the abstract, you start to see a setting up of this opposition between looking at antipassives as being something that's very much going with ergativity, and then the goal of the study is to show that the hypothesis that's actually being pursued here, I just noticed that my coloring here is different. So I've been going with the coloring where you argue for A and you argue against B, but here the person is actually arguing for the blue color, but it doesn't really matter. And the claim now is based on this this corpus study. Antipassives as well as ergativity are really due to some transitivity alternation or different transitivity classes, etc. But again, you see this tension being set up between two different views of seeing the world. You may think to yourself, why am I so much emphasizing this point? It's, I think, one of the most crucial parts of writing a good abstract. We'll be discussing in a few minutes aspects of the structure of the answer that is also quite important, but very often I do not see, so I believe in my own reading of abstracts, the ones that make their arguments more clearly are able to set up those oppositions within the abstract, sometimes very early on, sometimes later. The earlier, I think, the better, because you make sure that the reader or the reviewer has developed sufficient interest in the abstract that would get them to read with interest the remainder of the abstract. Here is another case in which the hypothesis B is just kind of in a, so I'll give you again a minute to quickly read this, this abstract or portion of the abstract. So in this abstract, an opposition is being set up with a lot of background in the first paragraph between a common denominator hypothesis about the study of language endangerment and loss, feeling that to understand language shift, there will be one common denominator language shift explanation for all the languages experiencing endangerment and loss, versus the hypothesis being set up by the authors, which is the one they argue for, is one in which one has to look at very different things in very different languages, depending on their meaning within a particular community. If you read this whole abstract, which is in the handout, you'll see that everything depends on this opposition. The first paragraph is a setup to state the opposition with a proper background, and the remainder of the abstract is the partial resolution of the of this tension by giving the support for why looking at things using hypothesis A, which is what's in red, is crucial. This is another nice case in which, and this allows me to bring up something important, which is titles. You know, already by reading the title of your abstract, a person has a good idea of what its content is going to be. And very often abstracts are, abstract titles are kind of very timid. This abstract is going to be about this topic in this language. Again, this kind of linear format that I mentioned very early on. And something that you see here is kind of the one of the hypotheses is stated in the title itself, which is a very powerful way of highlighting and showing the reader to what degree this is a question-answer format, and they already, having read the title, they understand the general opposition that will be presented and partially resolved through the abstract. I didn't give you enough time maybe to look at it, so I'll just give you a few seconds more. And you'll see this abstract, I'll bring it up again as to how the argument is built up to support hypothesis A. Notice again that very often, especially nowadays, the hypothesis A, hypothesis B is not carried out in this very, very concrete fashion that I talked about earlier, but in a very sort of discontinuous fashion. But my argument is that it's still there. And that's just not, it's not just interesting for some historical continuity kind of purpose. I think it's really important because understanding this mechanism of opposition is key to generating the interest of the reader and in adding coherence to the entire abstract. Here's another syntax type abstract, and what you see here is a especially because the one page is a very, very short format. This is a very common kind of way of presenting hypothesis A versus hypothesis B. One of the hypotheses could just be in a negation. So, so in this abstract, just within the first sentence, you get to argue that evidence from ellipsis licensing supports the view that head movement is not a narrow syntactic operation. So there is some background hypothesis that head movement is a narrow syntactic operation. And what is going to be argued here for is that it is not such a thing. And that's the hypothesis A, is that it is not a narrow syntactic operation. And within the very first line of the abstract, that tension is fully set up. And when you go through this abstract, you see everything is relating back to this first sentence. And the coherence is enormous because you have set up the problem, and the remainder is highly related because it's a solution to the problem that you set up. Just incidentally, when I've given previous types of talks about this, not so much about the abstracts, but about writing papers, I used to always think of it not as question and answer, but problem solution, rather than just kind of a historical survey of what you've done. Now I think the question answer is more crucial, but I go back and forth between seeing it as question answer versus problem solution. But I think those things are very, very much related. I'll tell you in a bit why I use sometimes yellow, etc. Here's another example where hypothesis B is presented as background, hypothesis A is presented as what is to be argued for. Again, the tension is set up very early on. Yeah. And here's another example where there are hypotheses A, B, and C. And within the field of phonetics, it's quite traditional, and psycholinguistics, it's quite traditional to label a section hypothesis, which I really like because it makes things much, much easier. It makes it easier for the writer and the reader. It makes it easier for the writer because it allows you to, they're kind of crutches. When you're able to use a format where the what you're trying to do, this argumentation style, is obvious in the language that you are using. Here is a hypothesis where you're actually using the language of the word hypothesis and the word prediction and the word evidence, etc. It makes it easier for the writer to structure the abstract and to make it quite obvious what the argument is. And it makes it easier for the reader because the reader is able to spot the different parts and see the degree to which they're related to each other. And because one of the major things you do as a reviewer, when I'm a reviewer, is to see, is the answer that someone giving related to the question that the person asked? Very often you'll see experiments or presentations or papers where some theory is set up in the beginning, and the results seem initially to have something to do with the theory being presented, but then when you look further, deeper and deeper and deeper, you start to realize that the experiment didn't really test what it was intended to test. And the more obvious the format that you're using is, and that it's a good match to the structure of the argument, the easier it is to spot when something has gone wrong. Another thing that I like about this abstract, so I'm a phonetician, so I read many, especially many phonetics type abstracts. So one of the nice things about this abstract is the three hypotheses are almost mutually exclusive. Very, very often, I would almost say like 40 to 50%, in my opinion, of papers that I review or presentations that I see and abstracts that I review, the things are labeled as hypotheses, but they're either about completely different things, so they're trivially mutually exclusive in the sense that they're each of them is just about something different. So one hypothesis is about the segmental inventory, and another hypothesis is about the tones or something like that, and they don't relate to each other. So you can call them hypotheses, but there is no sense in which they're really competing with each other, and stating them does not generate any real what I'm calling tension, because there isn't that opposition. Whereas here, there are really different predictions made by each of these hypotheses, and the rest of the abstract will show, and I think that's was a major part of the success of this abstract, is that it'll actually show you which of these hypotheses is actually true. Or we never actually show that. What we show is we give more evidence for a hypothesis, or we make a hypothesis less likely through our evidence. We never really prove things through this kind of research, because that's a very difficult thing to do. Another sort of play on this structure is stating A, and your discourse makes it clear what B is, what B must be. And I don't think that that's a bad thing at all. So you may think, given everything I've said, that I will say, oh no, you have to say both A and B. I don't think so. This is a nicely written abstract, and but the B is assumed. But it's quite clear that the B is assumed. What is not a good thing is if it's very difficult to figure out what hypothesis B is. So here, in a very, you don't have to read the whole thing. So there's either a strong influence or there isn't. So there's a strong influence of information status or there isn't. And there is no explicit statement of the opposite hypothesis B, but it's assumed, and that's fine. Here's another example of this kind of thing. Again, it takes a lot of setting up, which is fine. But then the crucial thing comes when the argument for the use of prosody and intonation, where the assumption is some other hypothesis that's competing with this one, is that one doesn't need this information to understand identity construction using language. And a third case, so again, there is a lot of setup, and then even though this is labeled as a prediction, I think of it as a hypothesis. Men would conform to the women's linguistic style in female-dominated virtual spaces, with the assumption that the hypothesis being argued against is that that is not the case, and that's what's actually carried out in the rest of this abstract. And last but not least is, I'll give you a chance to read this quickly. So last but not least is asking a question. Here done in a very precise way. I think that's more powerful when it's a one or maximally line and a half question. I very often will do this, and in rewriting something I've written, I realized, oh my God, this was a question, but it was like 4 or 5 lines. So you get lost in the middle of the question. That's a great way of asking what I'm calling asking the question. But I hope what you've seen so far is the hypothesis A, hypothesis B, and I could even argue that there's an embedded within this is a hypothesis A, hypothesis B thinking, but given in a completely different presentation. But that's not so interesting at this point. What I want to have sort of, what I'm hoping that you've gotten so far is how essential it is in a successful abstract to have set up that tension. But you can use a variety of kind of plays on a basic structure to be able to accomplish this. And what is opposed to all of this is a kind of what I would like to call a flat linear abstract where, okay, the first sentence tells you, I'm going to work on this problem in this language, and here's what I found. And occasionally you will find abstracts like this, and I have accepted abstracts like this in the past when the reader realizes, kind of enforces in their mind why this is important, why this is really interesting, and so on. And you feel like this is work that people should be exposed to because this is really important, because it answers questions that are still left hanging in literature. So you accept such an abstract, but I don't think the fact that, you know, such an abstract could be accepted is a good reason to follow that format, because many times the reader isn't as helpful and isn't as isn't as willing to kind of see the point that you're making about why this is important. And I just want to also lay it out in a kind of in a silly fashion, but one of the issues with this kind of linear laying out of what you've done in a flat format is the following. There are many thousands of languages. People like to say 7,000. I think that's just a silly number. I think it's many, many more, but in the many thousands. And there are many hundreds, if not thousands, of linguistic problems. So if you multiply those two numbers, you get millions of things that people could be investigating. And just choosing one of them, some combination of a phenomenon and some combination of the language, is not of sufficient interest to the reviewer and to the reader. Having said that, again, I would like to say we all work on particular problems in particular languages. So it's okay if how you came to a problem was by almost by pure randomness. Sometimes this actually works very nicely. I encourage my students to go to the library, go to a section, in the stacks where families of languages that they're not familiar with are spoken, and then picking a book semi-randomly and starting to look through it to see a grammar perhaps of a language they're not familiar with. And that's a great way of finding problems to work on. But picking the problem and presenting is not a random process at all. The presentation needs to begin with this tension, establishing why this is important, why this is interesting, what hypotheses in the literature are we able to find further evidence for or evidence against using our research. Okay, so what I have to say about the answer is a lot less than what I've given you about the question, which I think is but the thing that I've noticed in good abstracts is gradual laying out of the results. So within logic A, the hypothesis A, hypothesis B logic, data is not just observed stuff that's just flatly given out. It is the first part of the answer. It is evidence tied up cohesively and thoroughly with what lies before, the question that was asked, and what is necessary it's also tied up with what is necessary for the next step, drawing the conclusion about which of the hypotheses is the correct one, or not the correct one, which of the hypotheses do we find further evidence for or further evidence against. And there is an art of laying out evidence in a gradual, measured way, which I often do not see in bad abstracts, where kind of there's a data dump feel to it. It's just, this is what I found. Now, what I'm about to say is in many fields in linguistics is quite rare, but I'll still tell you how this works, because I think if your data, regardless of your field, lends itself to this, you should definitely use it, which is you present your evidence in this way. Okay, here's piece of evidence 1. This supports hypothesis A, but does not entirely remove support from B. So now we look at piece of evidence 2, and this supports A, but is really inconsistent with B. And this could go on and on and on, by the way. So this is the norm in psycholinguistics. Very often in papers, not so much in abstracts, in psycholinguistics, you'll find like 25 experiments, and they're in a chain. They're not just, I did 25 experiments about something. The first experiment has a particular result. The result is consistent with A, but does not rule out B. So you do the second experiment, but then some new hypothesis is generated, and you keep doing experiments to really find which hypotheses are supported. And very often in syntax and phonology and so on, I'll read abstracts in which they could potentially have used this kind of laying out of the evidence in a chain of related pieces, building up their evidence, but people very often don't lay it out in a chain like this, which is a very powerful way of laying out your evidence in a scientifically very convincing way. And I hope you see what I mean by this kind of laying out of the evidence versus this is what I found. So I'll just give you a couple of examples from a couple of the abstracts we have looked at so far. And now I'm using magenta, light green, and cyan to give you kind of the order. Is this abstract, and you can look at this abstract from beginning to end after our discussion, and you'll see that there's these 3 pieces of the evidence are not just randomly related to each other. The author couldn't have put what I have here in cyan at the beginning and just put them in a different order. There's an order in building up the conclusion that this author or set of authors reaches that is very much related to the order in which the evidence is laid out. And here's another case in which, and here I like this a lot, and it makes the job, again, easier for the author as well as the reader to literally number the evidence that is presented. This is an example of something else that I'll be talking about, which is later, so we'll go back to this abstract. And here is a third example in which, again, when you read this abstract on your own, you'll see that you couldn't have just randomly mixed up the three pieces of evidence that the authors found. They're given out in a chain, and the chain is necessary for drawing the conclusion. I'll just mention this very quickly. The reason I put this like an oval around the word crucially is I really like this when I'm reading abstracts. These are what I would like to call keywords that draw the attention of the reviewer to, in this cases, crucial aspects of the evidence. and again lend to kind of the drama of building up the evidence. And I like to encourage students to use these kinds of words that are attention-seeking and that are that make it easier for the reader to see the most important parts of the evidence. It doesn't obviously have to be a word like crucially, but other words kind of like that. And very much related to this, a strategy that I like, that's very much part of this measured use of the use of of what I would like to call meta words. I'll tell you what I mean by this in a second. Measured because you can do this all the time. This is just kind of a peppering of your abstract, 2 or 3 throughout the abstract, rather than being too explicit. So these meta words are a very direct way to structure your argument and to tell the reader reviewer that you have mastered the art of what's usually called scientific argumentation. I don't like that term, but that's what people use. They also add coherence, since within the assumed structure of the hypothesis A, hypothesis B skeleton of argument, they allow you to link the different parts of a discontinuous whole spanning the abstract. So these are words such as argue, hypothesize, ask, predict, evidence, results, conclude. You see why I call these meta words? They're about the structure of your argument. They're not words about syntax or language learning or phonetics or any of our subfields. They're really words about argumentation. And the sort of measured use of these really lends. And one thing that I had planned to do, but now because I'm starting to realize that I'm over the time that I was planning to talk, I'll encourage you to do this if you're interested. Take the PDF for the handout, which includes all the abstract, and search for each of these words. You'll find basically each of the abstracts using 1 or 2 or 3 of them. And that's part of why I think they were perhaps a small part, but still it plays a role in structuring the argument and getting the reader to focus on turns within the argument, etc. So you could do this yourself. You could search for these words, and you'll find that not every single abstract uses all of them, obviously, but a couple of them. Yeah, so you'll do this on your own. And I think this is the last thing I'm going to say. Another very important technique is what I would like to call successive abstraction. So drawing your conclusion 2 or maximally 3 times throughout the abstract with successively less abstract statements. So right when you have posed your question very, very early on in your abstract, and before you've laid out your evidence, you give a very brief and abstract sentence stating what you will conclude and why you will do that. So you see how this is kind of a maximal departure from a linear abstract, where you say what you're going to talk about, and you just talk about a bunch of data that you, or analyses that you presented. This kind of thing, you're actually starting with a question. You kind of give a very abstract but accurate statement of what you're going to conclude, and then you actually build up the argument. And this was a kind of a hint given to me when I was a graduate student, as I was starting to write abstracts, and this has been very, very important for me, because it gets the reader to kind of know what you're doing very, very early on, and rather than have to wait till the end of the abstract to decide whether they like it or not. So, and you could do this literally 3 times. One at the very beginning, one towards the middle, where as you're presenting your best evidence, you mention again that what this evidence will allow you to conclude. And this is still before the conclusion, where you give, in the least abstract language, what your conclusion is. So by successive abstraction, I mean the first statement of your conclusion should be very sort of precise, short, and just to give the reader a feel for where everything is going. What you don't want is for people to think that this is some kind of drama where they have to wait till the end to find out what happens. It's not like that. There are a lot of discourses where the conclusion is right at the beginning, but how you build it is what they have to read the whole abstract for. And you don't, again, as I stated here, this helps with the cohesion and eliminates the possibility of that you're just getting the reader to read on and on just because you're holding out on what the conclusion is. And I think, yeah, I give a couple of examples of, so in this abstract that begins with a question, there's a very abstract statement of the conclusion, basically two sentences right after the question. So you can look at this in more detail after the presentation. I thought I had another example, but if you look for this, these are the yellow lines that I put in the handout. And there are a couple of other examples of these where very, very early on, right when the question is posed, the answer is given. And then it's built up later. And just one very last thing is the explicitness in the conclusion. So very often there's a big question being addressed, but most of the abstract is really concerned with presenting a tight argument for new evidence for answering the big question. And this is a good thing. So like that, the abstract on configurationality, for instance, is an example of that. But very often, especially because of the short nature of an abstract, the conclusion drawn is just about what that abstract is mostly about, which is the tight argument for new evidence. And the conclusion about the big question is left kind of implied, because it's thought, okay, if I've answered the question about why this new evidence is important, it's implied that which of the hypotheses about the answer to the big question is I'm choosing. And obviously, you can guess, I think it's better to draw the big conclusion as well, adding, obviously, and one of the reasons people don't do that is they feel, well, there's a lot more work that needs to be done before one makes the big conclusion. And therefore, you add caveats and you add statement of, well, we still would need to know more and more about this and that issue before we can give a final answer to this big question. However, showing that the tight arguments for new kinds of evidence works is further evidence for the one of the answers to the big question laying out. And I think if you go through the abstracts, you see some abstracts doing that, some kind of holding back. And it's good to, what you never want to do is to claim that you've solved something that hasn't been solved. So I'm not asking you to always draw the biggest conclusion that you can at the end. You should do it as far as the data allows you to do it, but you shouldn't hold back too much in terms of conclusion. Okay, so this is my presentation, and I just want to conclude by saying that everything I've talked about is about the presentation and the argumentation. There is also the content. And, but I think that, sort of taking your abstract and the content of what you've already worked on and trying to frame it in ways that lends itself to this, allows you to see holes in the content by following this kind of very formulaic way of looking at the argument that you're presenting. So content is also extremely important, and the major part of the success of all of the abstracts that you saw is not just because they use some formula, it's that their questions were really interesting, and are resolving important questions within the field. But using the right structure allows you to see problems in your content. And that's it. So I'm happy to answer questions. And we have, I think, still quite a bit of time, at least 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes for questions.
Okay, thank you, Khalil. And let me just get started here. Okay, thank you again, everyone, for joining us. This is the question and answer portion of the webinar, and as a reminder, your microphones are muted so that you can ask questions using the question widget that you see on your GoToWebinar dashboard. I understand some people are having trouble finding the handouts. Ideally, you should see you'll see a couple of different options on your GoToWebinar dashboard. One will be audio. One will be handouts, one will be chat, one will be questions. I guess a few people at least have let me know they're having trouble with those. If what I have just said does not help you find them, go ahead and email me after the webinar and I will send the attachments to you. But again, they should be in the handouts widget on your dashboard. And also, so note that when Khalil is answering questions, he'll be answering questions about the scholarly content of your abstract. If you have questions about things like the length of the abstract, the font size, the margins, graphs, figures, word limits, etc., check with the call for abstracts, and you can find that on the LSA 2019 Annual Meeting page. And if you have any technical questions about submitting an abstract or have any difficulty submitting your abstract, you can email me directly. Again, I'm David Robinson, and my email address is, which I'll share with you momentarily, is drobinson@lsadc.org. So again, apologies to those of you who are having trouble finding the handouts, but I will make them available to you after the webinar. Okay, ready, Khalil?
Yes.
Okay, so the first question we have here is, how much background should be included in the abstract?
Very good question. So a very important marker of this kind of discourse, hypothesis A, hypothesis B, is enough background to be able to state the hypotheses. So the background shouldn't be, okay, I'm very often I'll see a kind of historical background section, even in an abstract, which would be, I'm talking about this topic in this language. And in 1967, someone said this. Then in 1993, someone said that. And then in 2010, someone said this. And so I would say that not in a dissertation, not in a paper, not in a book, should there be such a just a historical outline of what different people have said. That's not what the literature review and what whatever is of the literature review needs to be part of the hypotheses that you're stating or set up for the hypotheses that you're stating. So just sufficient for people to understand the hypotheses that you're setting up. And it's a really nice thing to go through the examples that I gave you and to look at where the hypotheses are. Very often you'll see they vary. Some of them are right at the beginning. Some of them are within, after 2 or 3 lines, but very rarely are they towards the end. You never need that much to be able to set up the hypotheses, or extremely rarely. Obviously, I'm not saying that. So if someone has worked on the language that you've worked on, and on that phenomenon, you should mention them. But that can be later or that can be part of the presentation. What's really important is just enough background to be able to set up the hypotheses.
Okay, thanks, Khalil. Another question here. Is the format of an abstract the same for a scientific paper and a thesis dissertation?
So I believe that so all writing, especially scientific writing, has very similar structure. So that's my belief. However, an abstract is different from a paper, which is different from a thesis, in that an abstract, you can get away without giving as much of an answer and as much of a built-up to the answer as you do in a paper or in a dissertation. So I do believe that what I'm presenting now, I could modify and tell you how to write a paper for a journal publication. And I see papers for journal publications all the time, and those are the kinds of things that I look for. But obviously an abstract, because of its very, very short length, but the short length doesn't mean that one could just say, I'm going to work on this and here's what I found. As you've seen in all the abstracts that I've presented, they do have that tension built up, etc. And that's also done in a journal paper. That's also done, I hope, in a dissertation or a book, chapter or a book.
Okay, next one is a really good question because I know many people, when they submit their abstract, the research that they're doing is not completed yet. So the question is, what if the research is not complete at the time the abstracts are due? Do you need to have a final conclusion that includes resultant data in the abstract? Is there a way to write a successful abstract without including final data?
That's a very good question, and that's different fields deal with this differently. There are fields like phonetics and psycholinguistics where it's very, very difficult to have a successful abstract where there are no significance levels already, significant tests already being reported on. People will look for that, and when you're looking amongst abstracts that are all very high quality, it's very difficult to accept an abstract that's more of a promissory note than an abstract that is that already has completed research that is being reported on. Same in a way like as in syntax, except in syntax or phonology, it's not so much that you have to have significance levels, but if you haven't done an analysis yet, well, and if you don't have a tableau already that, summarizes, some argument that you're making, it's extremely difficult for the reviewer to just take what you're saying as sufficient. But obviously, it's not like there's just not having done much of an analysis and having a completed analysis. There is a lot of middle way, and it's very, very difficult to decide. But I think if you have some initial results that you can report on, which is what you should really aim for, and I think, even just for this deadline, 10 days, so we have 10 days, I think, until the deadline for the abstracts. That's a lot of time. A lot of time in basically, not if you're doing like a longitudinal study perhaps, but for many, many subfields, it's enough time to still build up enough of a data analysis to be able to include in an abstract. But yes, so a good reason for rejecting an abstract is that it's a promissory note rather than but try to do as much within these 10 days to allow you to have initial results. Yeah, so I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thanks, Khalil. Another question. When providing background information, shall we assume that the reader knows nothing or little about the topic?
Very often students are told that assume that the reader knows nothing. I can tell you about the LSA because about our proceedings, because I'm on the program committee, it's extremely unlikely that a person will be reading your abstract who knows nothing about the field. We really search out for reviewers who volunteer, and we assign abstracts based on area of expertise. And I think if you're writing an ELS abstract or a CLS abstract or a LabFon or CUNY for psycholinguistics or any of these, I think you can assume, what you can assume is that a psycholinguistics abstract will be read by a psycholinguist. So they know about the methodologies used. They know about what you should not assume that they know are the hypotheses that you're going to be testing. So very often I'll read an abstract and feel that kind of the student feels, oh, well, these are things out there in the field. So everyone who does phonetics knows that there are people who believe that the objects of speech perception are articulatory, and other people who believe that they're acoustic in nature. So I'm just going to assume that, and I'm going to present my abstract in a way in which this is assumed. If what you're doing is testing the difference between those two hypotheses, you need to be able to state them, even though they're common knowledge in the field. But you don't need to state what if you're doing a syntax abstract, you don't need to state, the definition of every term that you're going to use. And if you're doing, language learning, you don't need to define, all the terms. But the hypotheses need to be clearly stated, and I think you can assume expertise, but not knowledge of the specific hypotheses you will be testing.
Okay, another question here. Do you have any strategy for the very first sentence in your abstract? Does it need to be interesting? Does it need to contain all the keywords? Thanks.
Okay, so first sentence, it's very, very difficult, but if you can, and state an abstract characterization of the problem in a sentence, maybe using negation if it's clear what your hypothesis B is, and then use the second sentence to give an idea of what your answer is going to be. Then third, fourth, fifth sentence, you could do the same thing again, but in a much more fleshed out fashion, where you state the problem in a more general format and less abstractly, and maybe summarize what your type of conclusion is going to be. And by the way, there's a bad way of doing this in which you're repeating everything that you do in the first couple of sentences in the third to sixth sentences. You don't want to do that. This is what I mean by successive abstraction. If you could lay out the problem and an initial idea of what the solution is going to be, and then use less abstract language that does not repeat exactly what you've done, I think that's a great use of the first 4 or 5 sentences before you build up your answer. So if you can do that, and maybe if you can do that with just giving a couple of sentences of background and then do all of that, I think that really lends itself. I really enjoy reading abstracts in which I know what's going to happen, and then I'm excited, like, how is this person going to prove this? Prove is the wrong word, but how are they going to really carry out this answer? But I already know kind of what's going to happen. And these are like movies where there's some murder scene at the beginning, and who's done it. So your excitement is about, is it the butler or is it the cook? It's more about the intricacy of how someone finds something instead of what is the conclusion. So if you're able to talk about that at the beginning very abstractly, that's a great thing.
Okay, thanks. So it's getting close to 2:30, but I think Khalil is available to run a little bit over. So, and we don't have too many more questions. So let's go ahead and please stay on if you can, and if you can, we'll have the recording available for you later. So here's a question. What are your thoughts on the use of section headings in an abstract?
I like them. And if you look through those abstracts and other abstracts, you'll find this cuts across. So you'll find syntax, you'll find phonology, you'll find, so it's not just some characteristic of phonetics and psycholinguistics, let's say, or applied linguistics. It's a characteristic that can run across. It makes things easier for you, and it makes things easier for the reader. So I very much encourage sectioning, but you can write a successful abstract that doesn't have that structure. But I think it's a good thing, and it gives you a it makes things easier for you. So you have 10 days. Some of you have already done your analyses and have or have run your experiments, and you're mostly working on how to put together the abstract. If you're in this camp and you're not busy still, running subjects, etc., then I would almost encourage you to spend a little bit of time, an hour or two, going through some of the abstracts and picking a format that you like and playing with that format and seeing, and some of them are structured indeed, and that's why one of the reasons I picked them. Excuse me. So I do encourage a structure, and you can use existing, existing cases to help you use that structure.
Okay, thanks. Let's see. Here is another one. Thank you very much for a most informative session. I have two questions. First question: while setting out alternative hypotheses A, B, etc., is useful for clarity, would not this tend to lead to a simplistic analysis of the often complex data, which is hardly ever as neat as simply A, B? And then secondly, by laying alternative hypotheses, would this eat into the always very tight word and space constraints on abstract writing?
Yeah, very excellent question. I think, so there is definitely a lot of truth to, if we try to get our very complex data into this kind of format, we're losing some of our insight into the data. I think that cases where that truly happens are extraordinarily rare, and that very often what is making us feel like we're losing something by posing the hypotheses and as alternatives, etc., is really because we haven't spent sufficient time in thinking within the idea space rather than within the data space. So data space is always extraordinarily complex. For my dissertation, I looked at, for many months, every day, all day at data. And when you're immersed in data, it is extremely difficult to jump beyond your data and think of simple things in some theoretic space that allow you to understand the data. And I think as much as you can do of that will help you understand your data way more. So I looked for months and months and months at my data. So I was looking in my dissertation at tongue movement between different segments. It's something very few people had looked at before. And I had to look through enormous amounts of data. Then a generalization came up, and I started to pursue. And then I understood the data so much more once I had made that generalization. Now, the question is, has that generalization made me lose insight into data that did not conform with it? Absolutely, yes. And I've been trying to kind of understand some of that data for 25 years, literally. So yes, indeed, you lose some insight into the data when you've looked at something that allows you to see it from a very simple perspective. But that's not a bad thing. You can still spend time recapturing the generalizations in the data that you could not fit within the larger framework. But I think it was really important for me to find the generalizations that I did. And But it's also really important not to lose that 15 or 20% of the data that you don't understand. You may further understand it once you really see what is common between the parts that are easy to integrate over and to simplify. So I would encourage you to do that as much as you can, to simplify within theory space, within hypothesis space, with the knowledge that there will be things left over which you could still discuss and spend time on afterwards, trying to see whether there is rhyme or reason or not. Very rarely one concludes at the very end that the initial simplifications were truly, truly problematic. Those cases happen, but I think they're rare.
Okay, great. Just a few more questions here. And this next one is from somebody who identifies as being totally new to this process. What comes first, writing a paper or writing an abstract? That is, do you first write the paper and then the abstract, or can you conceivably write an abstract with the intention of writing a paper should your abstract be submitted for conference presentation?
Okay, very, very good question. I think, so first of all, there is one thing missing from this question, which is the outline. So there is some scientific project that you're, and by the way, scientific, I don't mean anything about, I think all art is scientific. So by scientific, I just mean reasoned and thought through and creative and methodical approach to some problem in the world. It could be of very different natures. But at the beginning is an outline. So an outline of your ideas and of what structure there is to the data that you're looking at. And some of that will be in hypothesis space, and some of that will be in data space. Hypothesis space, I think that once you have an outline, if I could just add a few more words, since it's okay to go over slightly. I'll just jump over to a dissertation, and then I'll talk again about paper and the abstract. I encourage students to write dissertations in this way. I tell them, if you're going to write a 200-page abstract, begin with a one-page dissertation, which is the outline. Move to a 5-page dissertation, still in outline format, where you fleshed out each of the things in your one page. Then maybe a 20-page, then 200 pages, where your 200 pages are extraordinarily coherent because your 1 became 5, became 20, became 200. They all, and by the way, when you do this, you do very little rewriting. When people say, oh, it took me years to write my dissertation, what they mean is they wrote something, then they wrote it again and again and again and again, because they found out stuff later that made them rethink what they thought earlier. Whereas when you start out with an outline and progressively flesh out the outline, you're able to keep everything tightly together. And okay, so to go back to your question, I think that if you start out with an outline could easily become the abstract, and the abstract could then become the paper. So I think it's important to, but I think that it's very difficult to write a paper without first having an abstract. And most journals now require you to have an abstract for the paper. It's just a good exercise. Even if you have to rewrite the abstract, it's short enough that it's okay to rewrite it as you find out more and more things. But I would say write the abstract, then the paper, but having started out from an outline.
Okay, just a couple more questions, if you have time, Khalil. First one, how would you present an abstract for an exploratory study where there are no direct hypotheses, but questions instead?
I mean, you saw an example of laying out the question, and that's totally fine. So, because in my own understanding, hypothesis A, hypothesis B is just a way of asking a question. That's part of what I was trying to convey to you. So it's definitely possible to the word that bothers me is exploratory. So if you've already thought about your data, you've thought about your questions, I don't think it's very good to have an abstract that's just a question. It's good to have a question, but it's very good to have an answer as well. So exploration sometimes is used to mean it's okay to not give an answer, and I don't think that that's okay for an abstract myself. It's very difficult for me to imagine a successful abstract that's really just laying out a problem without making some proposal of a solution. Yeah.
Okay, and then the last question now. What do you think are some main differences / similarities between the abstract you submit for a conference and the abstract that appears at the beginning of a paper / thesis / dissertation?
Very good question. I don't think there ought to be that significant of a difference. So very often, for instance, in a dissertation or in a book, there will be an abstract at the beginning that just is a completely historical. In chapter 1, I do this. In chapter 2, I do this. 3, this. 4, this. That's a bad abstract. So let me change the answer I gave earlier. I think they're very, very different. So an abstract for a conference, given as a question and an answer, is very different from an abstract that just says, I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, then this, then this, then this, which is very commonly the kind of abstract you see at the beginning of a paper or at the beginning of a dissertation. In my opinion, I think even the abstracts at the beginning of a paper and at the beginning of a dissertation should be more like an abstract for a conference. But if you mean by an abstract for a dissertation or a paper being historical, then I don't think that should be the format for the conference abstract, which is question-answer style.
Okay.
Duly interpreted, interpreted not just literally as a question with a question mark, but a question as setting up of hypotheses, tension, etc. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Khalil, as many of the questioners have said, for a very interesting and useful discussion. And thank all of you in the audience for taking the time out of your afternoon to attend this webinar. We will, as I mentioned, we'll have a recording of it soon on the LSA's YouTube channel. I'll let you know when that is available. It should be no later than Monday. And for any of you that had trouble finding the handouts, I think what I'll do is just put them up on the page that we have on the LSA website for this webinar and send you a link to that page so that you can get to them yourselves. So thank you again, everybody, and bye. And thanks.
Bye, and good luck.